Program.com.
Okay, well now we're going to move on to something a little more exciting, and we're going to discuss ultrasound transducers, otherwise known as ultrasound probes. And if you remember from the previous discussion, the primary purpose of the transducer is to convert that electrical energy from the ultrasound machine to acoustic energy and vice versa. And it does this through the piezoelectric effect. And the piezoelectric effect, if you remember, is where an electrical current is applied to crystalline material in the probe. They change shape, vibrate, create ultrasound waves. Those ultrasound waves go out, hit the patient, are reflected back. Those reflected waves hit the crystals, change shape again, and then the transducer converts that signal back to electrical energy. Well, if you think of this in the form of the ultrasound machine shouting out a sound, it hitting a canyon, and that echo being reflected back and being received, we can think of these transmissions as echoes. And in fact, they transmit in a pulse echo mode, meaning they send out a pulse of waves and then they listen. Those waves are reflected back, then they send out another pulse, they listen. Those waves are reflected back. And in fact, they spend the majority of time listening. 99% of the time, they're listening, and only 1% of the time are they transmitting. So you can see from the picture at the bottom that there are many different types of transducers. So we divide them primarily by their frequency and shape. So we have high frequency transducers, we have mid frequency transducers, and we have low frequency transducers. The high frequency transducers are approximately in the above 10 megahertz range. The mid frequency are approximately 6 to 9 megahertz, and the low frequencies are approximately 1 to 5. These are not hard and fast numbers. These are just approximates, and there is definitely overlap. In addition to the frequency, then we divide it into the type of transducer, or the footprint, or the shape. And we're predominantly going to discuss three types. One is a phased array transducer. The second is a curvilinear transducer. And then the third is a linear. The phased array is a low frequency, curvilinear is a low frequency, and then the linear is a high frequency transducer. So let's start out with discussing the linear transducer. And the linear transducer is a high frequency transducer, typically in the range of 6 to 15 megahertz, although there is a variety of frequency ranges in these transducers. And because the range of frequencies is high, it's good for imaging superficial structures. But it does not have good penetration, and typically will only penetrate to 6 to 10 centimeters depth at the most. Now, there'll be many different shapes of this transducer, like a hockey stick or this shape that you see here, but the footprint is always linear and flat. Now, the footprint you see is this dark gray area that I'm outlining, and this is the part that touches the patient. And because it's flat and linear, on the image of a linear transducer, it produces a flat footprint at the top of the screen, and then a rectangle or square-like image. This is how you know that this image is produced from a linear transducer. So then what are some of the applications that we'll use a linear transducer for? Well, again, think of superficial applications. So something like vascular applications, where you are imaging the vasculature or doing venous access or vascular access. Things like DVT, another vascular application. Things like soft tissue, where you're imaging superficial structures and want very good resolution. Things like ocular, things like musculoskeletal applications, and some of lung applications, primarily looking at the pleural line. Now, these aren't the only applications, but this gives you some idea of what we use the linear transducer for. Okay, next let's look at the curvilinear probe. And the curvilinear probe is a low-frequency transducer, typically in the 2 to 6 megahertz range. And because it's a low-frequency transducer, you significantly improve your penetration from the linear transducer up to 26, even 30 centimeters of depth, depending on its frequency range. And if you notice from the curvilinear transducer, the footprint is much wider and it's curved. And that's where it gets its name, curvilinear. And therefore, on the image of the curvilinear, you have a curved footprint at the top of the screen. And because it's curved, the ultrasound beams then produce a sector style image. Some say it looks like a piece of pie with the tip of the pie bitten out of right here. But nonetheless, the curvilinear transducer predominantly is called the abdominal transducer because its primary application is abdominal ultrasound. But it can also be used for GYN applications, OB applications. You can use it as a low-frequency transducer in lung ultrasound. You could use it for a subcostal view of the heart if you don't have a phased array transducer, and many other applications. Well, next we're going to look at the microconvex probe. And really, the microconvex probe is just a smaller, higher frequency curvilinear probe. So this is typically a mid-range frequency probe, but can get into the higher frequency ranges and the lower frequency ranges. And it may be in the 6 to 10 megahertz range. So therefore, this has a good balance of penetration and resolution, and usually will go somewhere into the 12 to 16 centimeters of depth range. Now you'll notice the footprint on the microconvex probe is also curved, hence convex, but it's much smaller, hence micro. So the image that the microconvex probe then has that microconvex footprint at the top, and also produces a sector image as we saw in the curvilinear, but with a much smaller footprint at top. So what type of applications is the microconvex probe used for? Well, some would advocate that it can be used for pretty much anything in the body and serves as a single universal transducer. However, it is limited by its depth at times. So one of the primary applications that I've seen it used for is lung ultrasound. It's used in many different pediatric applications, so pediatric abdomen, neonatal head, etc. It can also be used for vascular, both in vascular imaging as well as in vascular access, and many other applications. Next, we're going to look at the endocavitary transducer. And the endocavitary transducer is a curvilinear transducer. It's also a mid-range transducer, typically in the 5 to 9 megahertz range. And therefore, just as we talked with the microconvex, it balances penetration and resolution. And as you can tell from the shape of the endocavitary transducer, it has particular applications. And its predominant application is transvaginal scanning, which we'll discuss in a bit. But you can see that here, the footprint is near 180 degrees. So it has a very wide field of view. The shape of the probe is so that it can get into cavities, hence endocavitary. And if we look at the shape that the endocavitary image produces, we'll see that it has this very wide field of view, nearly 180 degrees, and then produces a wide sector image from there. Now, primarily, as we discussed, this is used in first trimester OB, but you can also use it in other applications like peritonsillar abscess. I've seen it used in certain vascular applications like supraclavicular lines, etc. And lastly, we'll look at the phased array transducer. The phased array transducer is a low-frequency transducer, typically in the 1 to 5 megahertz range. And therefore, it has a very good penetration, usually up to 30 centimeters of depth. And what's unique about the phased array transducer, it also has a flat surface, like the linear transducer, and it also has a small footprint, or a near square footprint if you were to look at this image head on. So it produces a sector image as well, but you'll notice something different from this sector image. We have a flat transducer producing a sector image that comes to a point. And so people will say this looks like a piece of pie. Well, why does it come to a point right here? That's because the crystals inside the phased array transducer are either one single crystal or a small group of crystals. And then the ultrasound machine and transducer electronically steers the beams it sends out. So without getting too sophisticated on you, it will electronically steer beams to be sent out in this direction, then this direction, then this direction. And because it electronically steers those beams, it produces this sector image that comes to a point where those crystals are. So this is primarily used for cardiac scanning, and in fact was designed for cardiac scanning because it fits very well between the ribs in the intercostal areas and has significant depth penetration to view the heart. But this can also be used for abdominal applications or abdominal vascular applications like the aorta because of its good penetration. So as you can see, there is a myriad of transducers to choose from, and many that we didn't even discuss here that have specialized applications, such as a TEE probe or an intraoperative ultrasound, etc. But going back to how we categorize the transducer, this is how you're going to pick the transducer. So we categorize them based on the frequency, and so you want the highest frequency possible at the given depth. And then the second way we categorized it is by the shape or the type of transducer. And so you want a transducer that fits your application. So for example, if you're doing cardiac scanning, you would pick a phased array probe because the shape of it is good for intercostal scanning. Or if you're doing transvaginal scanning, the shape of the endocavitary probe will fit transvaginal scanning, etc. All right, med-crimmers, well, that was an overview of common ultrasound transducers, and next we are going to get into an important concept, ultrasound orientation and imaging planes.